The first light of dawn stretched across the deck of the USS Sentinel, washing the steel in a muted glow that made every shadow seem deeper. Lieutenant Commander Zephrina Dare moved within those shadows, her hands steady as she guided the hydraulic lift into position. The Tomahawk missile before her weighed nearly 3,000 pounds, yet she handled it with the assurance of someone who had done this countless times. Salt air pressed against her skin, and the faint sting of oil clung to her clothes. She kept her head down, her eyes on the work, as if the rest of the ship had forgotten she existed. A group of young officers lingered nearby, clutching paper cups of coffee against the morning chill. Their laughter carried easily across the quiet deck. One of them, Lieutenant Forrester, leaned toward another and muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "That's her. Ballast, bitch." The words were tossed carelessly, like a stone into water, rippling outward until they reached every ear in the circle. They chuckled, their breath fogging in the dim light. Zephrine never looked up. She had long since mastered the art of stillness, her shoulders slightly hunched, her face unreadable. The sting of mockery did not show, though it settled like a weight behind her ribs. A young crewman hurried past, his shoulder colliding with hers. The impact sent a shudder through the missile as it tilted on its harness. Gasps rose from the officers, but Zephrine's reflexes were quicker than theirs. Her gloved hands steadied the weapon with practiced ease, guiding it back into alignment before any alarm could sound. The crewman did not pause to apologize. He kept moving, as if she were nothing more than an obstacle on the deck. The laughter resumed, softer now, yet still at her expense. She returned to her task without comment, the muscles in her arms taut beneath the naval utilities that hid faint scars, the kind no one cared enough to ask about. By the time the sun pushed higher, she had finished loading the final missile. Her boots echoed against the deck as she slipped away from the noise and the glances. The passageway to her quarters was narrow and cool, filled with the scent of metal and disinfectant. Inside, the small space was stripped of personality. The bed was neatly made, the blanket tucked with military precision. A single photo frame sat on the desk, turned face down, its glass coated with a thin layer of dust. Against the wall hung her uniform jacket, 3 service ribbons pinned to the chest, half hidden in shadow. Below the bunk, a footlocker waited, its surface untouched long enough that dust had gathered like a shroud. Zephrine sat on the edge of the bunk and tugged off her gloves. The skin of her hands was calloused and lined, the hands of someone who had done this work far longer than the others around her. She rubbed her palms together slowly, staring down at the ridges as if they contained answers no one else could read. For a moment, a flicker passed across her expression, the ghost of another life when she had not been ballast but command. Then the mask slid back into place, her features smoothing into practiced neutrality. She lay back for a moment, listening to the faint vibration of engines beneath the deck, a rhythm that reminded her of duty, of permanence, of chains she wore willingly. The intercom cracked to life, summoning senior personnel to a briefing in 1 hour. Zephrina exhaled, a sound that was almost a sigh, and rose. She placed her gloves neatly on the desk beside the photo. The footlocker remained closed, its lock catching the dim light. She touched it briefly, fingers lingering on the cool metal, before turning away. Whatever lay inside stayed buried for now. On this ship she was not a commander, not a veteran of battles whispered about in sealed rooms. Here she was ballast, furniture, the unseen hands that kept weapons ready, invisible, dismissed, and enduring quietly. She moved back into the shadows, where the others preferred to forget she existed. The briefing room on the USS Sentinel was a cocoon of harsh light and tense silence. Digital maps glowed across the central display, their shifting lines and overlapping colors, sketching borders so tangled they seemed ready to ignite with the smallest spark. The low hum of machinery blended with the scratch of pens and the shuffle of uniforms as officers found their places. Admiral Thaddeus Westerard, stood at the head of the table, his silver hair trimmed with precision, his presence commanding without effort. Beside him, Captain Rhodes leaned forward with the air of a man convinced of his own authority. His voice carried easily over the room as he outlined weapon readiness, his tone sharp but confident. Zephrine Adair remained at the far wall, almost part of it, her posture quiet and unremarkable. Shadows clung to her frame as if the light itself did not want to draw her forward. She listened without shifting her weight, eyes fixed on the tactical display. When Rhodes announced that the Sentinel's weapons could be deployed in 90 seconds flat, she felt her throat tighten. It was wrong. There was a calibration lag. 3 minutes at least. The truth rose like muscle memory, instinct telling her to correct. But she kept her lips pressed shut. The faintest flicker crossed her eyes. A minute betrayal of her self-control. And she forced her body still again. Only one man noticed. Lieutenant Karim Nazri. The ship's tactical officer sat opposite the display. His sharp gaze sweeping the room, he caught the movement, the fractional tightening around her eyes, and his attention lingered on her even as Rhodes dismissed another question. To others, she was furniture. A silent figure in naval utilities, with little to offer. To him, something did not align. He tilted his head slightly, storing away the observation like a classified note. When Westerard spoke, every man and woman in the room straightened. Yet Zephrine's stance barely shifted. She did not need to show recognition of authority. It was etched into her bones already. Nasri read it in her stillness, in the way she absorbed information with the quiet focus of someone who had once commanded. The meeting ended with the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of boots. Officers clustered in small groups, discussing maps and possible movements, their voices low and urgent. Zephrine slipped out silently, her hands clasped behind her back, her stride neither hurried nor slow. She preferred to vanish before anyone thought to ask why she had been there at all. But Nasri followed, his steps measured until he caught up with her in the corridor. The hum of the ship filled the silence between them, a backdrop of engines and metal groaning under constant strain. You knew he was wrong, Nasri said quietly, just for her. His tone carried no accusation, only curiosity. She did not glance at him, her gaze fixed forward. Sir, I follow manuals, she replied, her voice even, respectful. My role is ordnance management, nothing more. Her words were neat, practiced, designed to close doors rather than open them. Yet the faint lift of her shoulders betrayed the reflex of command she could not fully bury. Nasri slowed his pace, letting her pass him slightly, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of ink beneath her collar. The symbol was faint, half hidden, but he recognized the trident crossed with anchor. He had seen it once before, buried in intelligence files, referencing units that did not officially exist. His curiosity sharpened. Though he said nothing, she adjusted the collar casually, masking the movement as habit. But the damage was done. He knew there was more to her than the invisible ordnance officer she pretended to be. Zephrine continued down the corridor without looking back, her expression unreadable. Yet behind her calm silence, the edges of her buried life pressed dangerously close to the surface, a truth she could no longer entirely keep hidden. The weapons control room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of machines and the muted beep of diagnostic systems. Zephrine Adair worked alone, sleeves rolled neatly, her fingers moving with deliberate precision across the panels. Each adjustment to the missile interface was logged, her motions calm and practiced. She recalibrated sequences line by line, the way one might repair a clock. Each small action connected to something larger. Her reflection appeared faintly in the porthole glass above the console, a ghost watching itself work. Outside that same window, the sea stretched wide, blurred by haze. The horizon, a smudge of silver against darker water. She paused for just a fraction of a second when a shape broke the line between sea and sky. It was subtle at first, a darker form sliding into focus through salt mist. As the haze thinned, the outline sharpened into the unmistakable silhouette of a foreign frigate. The distance was still considerable, yet she knew the class, the shape of its mast, the arrangement of its hull. Recognition tightened her shoulders instinctively. The reflex of a commander who had once read threats before they announced themselves. Her hand hovered over the communication panel, the impulse immediate, trained through years of necessity. All she had to do was press, report the contact, raise the alarm before anyone else had even seen it. For several long seconds, her palm hovered over the button, caught between duty and survival of another kind. Reporting it would raise questions. How did she recognize the vessel so quickly? Without scope confirmation, without data. That knowledge was not supposed to belong to an ordnance officer hidden in shadows. Slowly, she withdrew her hand and returned her attention to the calibration. Her heartbeat slowed by force of will, her breathing measured. Silence was safer. The radar pinged softly behind her, confirming movement. But she did not turn. She finished the sequence, fingers tapping commands with the ease of repetition. The ship outside remained on her mind, a shadow pressing at the edge of thought. The door opened, the hiss of hydraulics breaking the stillness. Lieutenant Nasri stepped inside, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp, always searching. He glanced at her hands, moving over the system with far more confidence than procedure manuals ever required. "Long morning," he said, his voice quiet against the hum. She gave him the briefest nod without looking up. He walked toward the window, studying the horizon as if casually curious. Unusual to see a vessel so far east, he remarked, tone deliberately vague. She did not respond, her focus fixed on the display. After a pause, he added, "Strange for them to break patrol pattern here." The words hung between them, bait disguised as conversation. She lifted her eyes, just enough to answer, "Yes." Strange for a Jiangkai class to be this far from its usual routes. The reply was smooth, almost automatic. But the moment it left her lips, she felt the slip. Nasri tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one might study a puzzle piece that did not quite fit. She forced herself back into stillness, masking the reaction with a calm exterior. "I meant unusual for any vessel," he said softly, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. She returned her gaze to the calibration screen, her face carefully neutral. "My concern is maintenance. Lieutenant, patterns and routes are not part of my duties." Her voice was steady, controlled, but inside she felt the weight of the mistake settle like lead. Nasri nodded as if satisfied. Though the flicker in his eyes betrayed his continued interest, he lingered near the communication panel, then turned slowly toward the door. She watched him leave. Her reflection caught again in the porthole glass, doubled over the silhouette of the foreign frigate outside. Her instincts had betrayed her. Even as her silence tried to shield the truth, the missile deck was hotter than the rest of the ship, a space where machinery pressed heat into the air until every breath felt heavy. Zephrine Adair worked with her jacket, stripped away, her plain t-shirt clinging damply to her back as she leaned over the jammed loading mechanism. Sweat rolled down her temples and gathered at her collar. The problem was stubborn, a metal joint wedged out of alignment, and she gripped the wrench with steady force, coaxing it back into place. The hum of engines echoed through the deck, joined by the faint drip of condensation that fell from pipes overhead. Her movements were methodical, her mind narrowed to the task, until the wrench slipped suddenly from her damp hand and clattered against the steel floor. The noise rang louder than it should have, sharp and metallic, breaking the rhythm of the room. She bent to retrieve it, her shirt lifting just high enough beneath the harsh lights to expose the pale lattice of scars that climbed across her lower back and shoulder blades. They were not random injuries. The marks followed a distinctive pattern, a series of burns and ridges left by a proximity mine, the kind deployed only in classified operations. The scars caught the light for only a moment, but it was long enough. The heavy door to the deck swung open, and Admiral Thaddeus Westerard entered with Captain Rhodes at his side. Their conversation faltered mid-sentence as both men froze. Westerard's expression changed first. His eyes widened, then narrowed, and the color drained from his face. The silence that followed spread like a wave across the deck, swallowing even the background hum of machines. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze fixed on the scars. The Admiral's voice emerged barely above a whisper, yet it carried all the weight of a secret dragged from the grave. Operation Blackfish. The name had not been spoken aloud in years. Rhodes blinked, confused, glancing between Westerard and Zephyrin. "Sir, I do not understand," he began, but his words faltered when he saw the Admiral's intensity. Zephyrin straightened, wrench in hand, and turned toward them. The stoop of an ordnance officer fell away in an instant. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and her eyes locked forward with the composure of someone who had once carried command. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Captain Rhodes stared, bewilderment carved across his features. Westerard, however, seemed overcome by recognition and something else, something close to reverence. He took another step closer, his voice steadier now, though, still edged with disbelief. "You were reported killed in action. It was easier that way," Zephyrin replied, her voice calm but sharper than it had been in months. "Easier than explaining what happened. For everyone involved." Her words dropped into the silence like stones, measured and final. Rhodes opened his mouth to speak again, but Westerard raised his hand, silencing him. The Admiral's posture shifted, his stern military bearing giving way to something more personal. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a formal salute, his voice steady now. "Captain Rhodes, you have Commander Zephyrin Adair on your ship. 7 years ago, she commanded a covert extraction mission in the Strait of Hormuz. When their position was compromised, she used herself as bait to draw enemy fire away from 38 hostages and 14 wounded personnel." The words struck the air like a revelation. Rhodes' bewilderment deepened, his eyes darting to Zephyrin, as though seeing her for the first time. Across the deck, Lieutenant Nasri had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension, and his face betrayed the shock of confirmation. Westerard continued, his tone hardening as memory carried him forward. Her tactical deception enabled the rescue craft to escape. She was captured and held for 11 months. The mission remains classified, but the 38 civilians she saved included my daughter. Zephyrin said nothing, her eyes steady. Though something flickered behind them, the memories lived there, carved as deeply as the scars across her back. Rhodes shook his head, still struggling to reconcile the quiet woman he had overlooked with the commander now standing before him. "Why was I never informed?" he demanded. "Because that was the agreement," Westerard answered gravely. The Admiral's salute held for another moment before lowering, but the silence it left was just as heavy. For the first time in years, Zephyrin no longer stood invisible. Her scars had spoken for her, stripping away every pretense. The truth she had buried was now undeniable, and the weight of recognition had finally returned. The alarm tore through the ship with a shriek that left no room for hesitation. Klaxons blared from every corridor, and red lights strobed across the bridge. As crew members scrambled into position, Captain Rhodes barked orders above the noise, his voice clipped and urgent, while Admiral Westerard stood close by. Scanning the tactical display, the screen lit up with 3 hostile vessels pushing into range from the east, their formation deliberate, their signals distorted through layers of electronic jamming. Communications flickered, long-range channels collapsing into static. The tension in the room thickened with every second. Zephyrin Adair stood near the wall, hands clasped loosely behind her back, her eyes locked on the tactical table. She could read the pattern instantly. The enemy ships weren't advancing blindly. Their overlapping arcs of movement were precise, angled in a way that forced the Sentinel toward the shoreline, where land-based batteries could cover the trap. The strategy was familiar, almost painfully so. She felt her chest tighten, memory and instinct pressing forward. Rhodes called for updates, snapping at lieutenants who struggled to interpret the display. Nasri gave fragmented reports, frustration in his tone as jamming grew heavier. Finally, Rhodes glanced toward her. Reluctance evident. Commander, he said, the title sounding strange in his mouth. Your assessment. The room fell momentarily still. Zephrine stepped forward, the red light flashing across her face. As she leaned over the display, her finger traced lines across the glowing map, her voice calm and precise. They are not attempting direct engagement. Their formation channels us toward the shallows here and here. Shore-based systems are already calibrated to cover this kill zone. If we continue forward on current heading, they will have us in position within 20 minutes. Rhodes frowned, clearly unsettled. But he did not interrupt. Her finger moved again, marking a series of subtle angles. We adjust course 15 degrees starboard while maintaining the appearance of our trajectory. At the same time, we transmit a false burst, suggesting reinforcements have been deployed. They will intercept the signal even through the jamming. Then we release sonar buoys here and here to create the illusion of a defensive perimeter. They will believe they have been outmaneuvered. Skepticism flickered across Rhodes's expression. Deception. Not engagement, he asked. They are testing. Captain. Not committing. She replied, her tone level. If they believed they had the advantage, they would already be firing. What they want is for us to make the wrong move first. We give them reason to withdraw without admitting defeat. Her certainty carried more weight than volume. Nasri leaned forward, already nodding, as he keyed in her proposed adjustments. Westerard gave the faintest nod, his eyes never leaving her. The bridge crew exchanged quick glances, the atmosphere shifting as unspoken recognition grew. Rhodes hesitated for only a moment longer before issuing the order. Execute the commander's plan. The bridge erupted into movement. Signals transmitted. Buoys deployed. The ship angled with subtle correction, while outwardly appearing steady on course. Officers called out confirmations in tense voices, each step aligning with her strategy. Zephrine stood slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the tactical screen. Slowly, the enemy icons shifted, their formation adjusting in response. They are reassessing, Nasri reported, his tone steadier now. Lead vessel altering course. The others following. The bridge held its collective breath as the seconds stretched. Then the pattern broke. One by one, the hostile ships peeled away, widening their perimeter, before drawing back beyond the 12-mile line. The tension drained in a rush of sound as officers exhaled relief they did not dare show until now. Rhodes stared at the screen, then turned to her, something like respect in his eyes for the first time. Accurate in every detail, he said, his voice low but carrying. She inclined her head slightly, her expression unchanged, though her pulse still hammered. In crisis, the mask of invisibility had fallen away. Command was not something she could bury. It lived in her. Indéniable. The briefing room was sealed, the hum of the ship muted beyond its thick walls. Only the faint vibration of engines trembled through the deck beneath their feet. Admiral Thaddeus Westerard sat at the head of the table, his hands folded with deliberate calm, while Captain Rhodes shifted uneasily beside him. The glow of the tactical display had been dimmed, leaving the room heavy with shadow, and on the table the reflection of a command insignia flickered faintly in the low light. Zephrine Adair stood at ease near the far wall, her expression unreadable, though the air around her seemed to thrum with tension. Westerard was the first to break the silence. His voice carried the measured cadence of a man speaking of something he had rehearsed in private countless times but never spoken aloud. He recounted Operation Blackfish, the mission that had never officially existed. A diplomatic delegation had been taken hostage in volatile waters, and orders from the Joint Chiefs had been clear. Wait. Reinforcements would arrive within 24 hours. Westerard's voice lowered as he explained how the intelligence reports suggested the hostages would be moved before those reinforcements could ever reach them. Rhodes listened with growing disbelief, his gaze darting between the Admiral and Zephyrin, struggling to connect the quiet officer he had dismissed with the commander described in the story. Zephyrin's voice joined the retelling with no flourish. Only quiet fact. She explained how she had diverted enemy fire, how she had drawn attention onto herself so that others could escape. 38 civilians and 14 wounded personnel had made it out because she had become the decoy. Her tone was stripped of pride, as if she were reading a line from a manual rather than recounting a decision that had cost her 11 months of captivity. She did not speak of the details of those months, only that they existed, only that she returned different. Her scars had already told enough of that story. Rhodes leaned forward, his hands tightening on the edge of the table. You saved them, every one of them, and they buried you for it. The words carried disbelief edged with anger. Westerard nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving Zephyrin. He explained how her methods had violated protocol, how the Joint Chiefs had deemed it impossible to recognize her actions publicly without undermining the authority of the chain of command. Her record had been sealed, her name erased from the official files. They had offered her a discharge, full benefits, a quiet exit from the service she had bled for. Zephyrin's gaze held steady, her voice calm, though the weariness beneath it was unmistakable. I refused. If I could not serve in command, I would serve where they permitted. My oath was not dependent on recognition. The statement hung in the air, simple and absolute. Cutting through the layered justifications that had been built around her erasure, silence followed, heavy enough to press against the walls. Rhodes stared at her, words caught in his throat. Westerard inclined his head slowly, the smallest gesture of respect. The truth had been spoken, and though the institution had betrayed her, Zephyrin remained. Her presence in that room was itself an act of quiet defiance, proof that no file could erase what lived within her. Dawn came quietly to the USS Sentinel, the first light brushing the deck in soft gold that glinted against polished metal. Zephyrin Adair walked its length with steady steps, her uniform immaculate, the gold insignia at her collar catching the new light. The air was cool, touched with salt, and the ship stirred with morning activity. Crew members straightened unconsciously as she passed, their eyes drawn not only to the insignia, but to the calm authority she carried with it. Some of the younger officers who had mocked her only days before stiffened, unsure whether to salute or simply avoid her gaze. Lieutenant Forrester, who had once spoken the cruel nickname, swallowed hard as she neared. She acknowledged him with a brief nod, neither granting nor denying his discomfort. Her focus was elsewhere. The whispers had already spread through the ship. Operation Blackfish, a name spoken only in fragments, lingered in conversations across the mess. No one knew every detail, but everyone now knew the woman who had been silent Ballast was the commander who had saved 38 civilians at terrible cost. Rumor filled the gaps, the classified files left empty, and with each retelling her, invisibility eroded further. By the time she reached the briefing room, the air was thick with expectation. Inside, officers rose instinctively as she entered. The tactical display table glowed with shifting maps, lines of movement charted across the Pacific. For a moment, silence hung in the room, as if each person waited to see what role she would claim. Zephyrin stood at the head of the table, her expression composed, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the console. At ease, she said, her voice steady, unforced. They obeyed, but their eyes remained fixed on her, their curiosity sharpened by respect that had not been present before. She began the briefing with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. Her fingers traced across the display, marking where hostile vessels had moved in recent days. Identifying subtle patterns that suggested testing of patrol routes. They are not random, she explained. Each maneuver is designed to provoke a reaction, to measure our thresholds. If we follow standard patterns, they will map our responses within a week. Her tone was calm, her delivery precise. And the room leaned in to listen. Questions came from officers who only yesterday would have ignored her presence. Their words carried a note of deference, as though they were careful not to miss any detail she offered. She answered without arrogance, patient and measured, shifting seamlessly into the role she had once thought forever lost. Some of the faces across the table showed quiet shame. Those who had dismissed her could not hide their awareness now. Their expressions flickered with unease, but also with the relief of knowing she stood among them. Captain Rhodes entered midway, observing silently for several minutes as she guided the discussion. His gaze moved from the display to the attentive officers, then finally to Zephrine. He gave the smallest nod, a recognition that her command presence had taken hold in a way no order of his could have demanded. By the end of the session, the room carried a different weight. The officers did not scatter as they once had. Instead, they lingered, trading thoughts with her, seeking her insight. She closed the briefing with quiet finality, instructing the tactical team to adjust patrol routes and prepare contingency scenarios. When she stepped away from the table, the officers followed her lead with renewed energy. The gold insignia at her collar caught the light once more as she left the room, not as ballast, not as shadow, but as a commander acknowledged. The night air was cool on the observation deck, touched with salt and the faint smell of oil carried from the ship's engines. Zephrine Adair stood at the rail with her hands resting lightly on the metal, her eyes fixed on the vast stretch of moonlit water. The sea shimmered silver under the glow, endless and quiet, a mirror of her own stillness. Beneath her uniform, the scars remained, unseen but always present. The lines of fire carved across her back, a reminder of choices that had never left her. She drew in a long breath, letting the rhythm of waves steady her thoughts. For years, invisibility had been her shield, the silence in which she could keep breathing. It had kept her alive when recognition would have broken her. Now the silence felt heavier. No longer protection, but memory pressing down. The sound of footsteps came from behind, deliberate but not rushed. She did not turn until Admiral Thaddeus Westerard joined her at the rail. His presence carried weight even in quiet. But tonight, he spoke with the tone of a man leaving rank at the door. For a while, they both watched the water without words, the sea rolling endlessly before them. Then his voice broke the silence, softer than she had ever heard it. "You saved her," he said, his eyes still on the horizon. "My daughter was among the hostages. I never told anyone. You carried the burden alone, but you did not carry it for nothing." Zephrine's gaze did not shift. "Some truths are easier left unspoken," she answered. Her voice was calm, but beneath it lay the fatigue of years of silence. "Invisibility kept me alive, Admiral. It gave others the chance to keep living too. That was enough." He turned toward her, studying her profile, the steady strength in the way she held herself. From his pocket he withdrew a small object and set it on the rail between them. The insignia caught the moonlight, glinting faintly, its weight heavier than the metal it was made of. "It should not have taken this long," he said, "but it is yours still. You earned it before, and you have earned it again." Her eyes lowered to the insignia. The light reflected sharply across its surface, and for a moment she saw not the symbol but the years denied to her. The scars, the forgotten service, her fingers then closed slowly around the metal. The cool weight settled into her palm, unfamiliar yet inevitable. She did not thank him. Gratitude was not the right word. Instead, she breathed deeply, the acceptance showing in the way her shoulders eased, in the way she stood straighter. Recognition does not change what was lost. she said finally, "but it does allow me to serve openly again. That is enough." Westerard inclined his head, respect clear in the gesture. They stood in silence a moment longer, the horizon stretching without end. Before he left her to the night, Safrine remained, the insignia resting against her chest now, the sea before her steady and wide. Later, she returned to the tactical display. The room alive with quiet activity, officers turned as she entered, their movements pausing for the smallest fraction of a second. She stepped to the table, shoulders square, eyes sharp. The maps glowed beneath her hands, lines of conflict and possibility, and she studied them with the calm assurance of someone who had already been tested. The scars remained, but they no longer defined only pain. They were memory. They were proof. And they were hers. The shadows had lifted just enough to let her stand fully visible once more, ready for what came next.